My father used a rule every single day of his financial life, and for years I assumed everyone knew it. I assumed it was common knowledge. Something passed from parent to child, elder to student, the way you learn to wash your hands before eating or lower your voice near something sacred. I assumed the whole world was walking around with this understanding, quietly operating underneath their decisions. Then I started watching, really watching. And I realized almost no one had been taught this. Not in school, not at home, not in any of the countless books, programs or seminars promising to fix what hurts. I have spent decades in the world of money. I have helped people grow assets, and I have watched people lose everything they built. I have seen wealthy families become broken households within 2 generations, and I have seen people with almost nothing slowly build lives of genuine peace and provision. And in all that time, across all that watching, I kept seeing the same hidden mistake. Not occasionally, constantly. In people with high incomes and people with low ones. In the disciplined and the careless. In the educated and the self-taught. The mistake does not look like a mistake. That is the danger of it. It looks like wisdom. It looks like caution. It looks like responsibility. And because it looks exactly like the right thing to do, almost everyone keeps doing it, keeps suffering from it, and never once suspects it is part of the problem. What I am going to share with you today is what my father shared with me, what his teacher shared with him, what was carried forward through a lineage that understood money not as a game of strategy alone, but as a spiritual relationship that either flows or collapses depending on one invisible thing. Most people are blocking what they pray for by the very way they hold money. And today, that changes. I want to speak directly to something you may not have said out loud in a long time. You work. You try. You apply the discipline you were told to apply. You save when saving hurts. You cut back when cutting back cost you more than money. You track, you plan, you wait, you hope. And still, there is something that does not move. Still, there is a ceiling you can touch but not break. Still, at the end of a month that required everything from you, the number looks almost the same as it did before. You are not crazy for feeling this. You are not weak. You are not the problem in the way you have been told. The loop most people live inside looks like this. Income arrives. Instead of peace, anxiety rises. The hands tighten. Every decision becomes defensive. Small fears become loud ones. Money leaves anyway, not because you were reckless, but because fear-driven decisions rarely produce calm outcomes. And then the shame comes quietly. The private voice that says, "I should be further by now." I have sat across from people who were working 60 hours a week and still felt like they were barely holding on. I have seen people with genuine discipline, people who would embarrass most so-called financial experts with their consistency, still lying awake at 3 in the morning, wondering why nothing multiplies. That exhaustion is real. That silent envy you feel when someone else seems to move easily through the very space where you keep hitting walls. That is real too. And the fear of looking up in 10 years and finding yourself in the same place, that is one of the heaviest fears a serious person can carry. But here is what I need you to understand. Your problem is not a character failure. It is not laziness dressed up as effort. What you are living in is the result of a distorted inner posture toward money, one that was handed to you by people who were themselves given the wrong map. The rule that was supposed to protect you may be the one starving your future. Let me be more direct about what that wrong map looks like. Most people, when money feels unsafe, grip harder, hold tighter, delay everything that feels like release until some distant theoretical moment when safety finally arrives. They call this prudence. They call it being responsible. And on the surface, in the language the world has taught us, it sounds exactly right. But here is what is actually happening underneath that grip. When you hold money from fear rather than from order, you are sending a signal to the deepest part of yourself. The signal is, there is not enough. The signal is, I am not safe. The signal is, release is danger. And a mind living inside that signal does not make clear decisions. It makes defended decisions, small decisions. decisions designed to prevent loss rather than create life. Fear-based preservation can signal lack to the soul before it ever solves the problem in the account. Money, in the understanding I was raised with, is not a thing to be trapped. It is not an idol to be guarded in a locked room and worshipped in silence. It is something that is meant to move, to flow through an aligned life with purpose, intention, and order. The people I have watched build genuine, lasting wealth, the ones whose families carry something forward beyond one generation, did not accumulate through tighter fists. They cultivated a different relationship altogether. And the people who cling the hardest, who guard every dollar as though loosening their grip will cause everything to collapse, often find themselves asking the same question decade after decade. Why does nothing multiply? I'm going to show you the exact principle that changes this. Not a theory, not a motivation speech. The precise inner orientation and sequence I use before moving any meaningful sum of money, whether I am investing, allocating, building, or giving. And I did not read this in a book. I did not hear it at a seminar. I learned it in a room that smelled like old books, candle smoke, and wood so worn it felt like it had been prayed over for 100 years. This did not begin with me. I want you to understand that before we go deeper. What I carry was given to me, and what was given to me was not invented by the man who gave it. It was received, the way true things are received, through years of watching, and loss, and restoration, and quiet conversation with people who had lived long enough to see the same patterns move across very different circumstances. My father did not teach me this as a trick. He did not present it as a strategy. He spoke about it the way a person speaks about gravity, not as something you choose to believe in, but as something that is simply operating whether you acknowledge it or not. I have seen this principle hold during market collapses, during personal financial crises, during tight seasons where every number was frightening. And I have seen it hold during abundance, which is in many ways the harder test, because abundance without inner order does not stay. It inflates, it distorts, it becomes something heavy and anxious and finally breaks under its own pressure. In the lineage I was raised in, wealth was never treated as a purely financial subject. The conversation about money was always also a conversation about stewardship, about what you owe before you take, about the right order of things, about blessing and restraint and release. When you strip money away from any moral and sacred frame, when you make it only about mechanics, only about optimization, only about strategy and return, you lose the part that actually governs its peace. You can be tactically brilliant and spiritually broke at the same time, and broken stewardship always, eventually, costs more than bad investments. The first time I saw this law clearly demonstrated, I was far too young to understand why it mattered, but I watched, and what I watched marked something in me that no classroom ever touched. I was young enough that the table felt large. My grandfather sat at one end, the way a man sits when the room already belongs to him without any effort. Not arrogance, settledness, the kind that comes from long years of knowing who you are and what you are doing in the world. There was low light. There was the smell of something that had been cooked earlier and the quieter smell of old paper, because he always had something open nearby. A prayer book, a ledger, some combination of the two. He had received something that week. I did not know what exactly. An amount, a return on something, a payment that had been delayed and had finally come. And before he did anything with it, before he set aside what the household needed, before he thought about what he wanted, he did something small and completely serious. He set a portion aside. Not after, first. He counted it out quietly. He placed it in an envelope. He said something over it that I could not fully hear, but his face was the face of a man completing an obligation he considered sacred, not performing generosity for an audience, but honoring an order he believed was older than him. I asked him about it later. I was young enough to think it was strange, old enough to feel that the strangeness deserved a question. He looked at me the way elders look at you when they have been waiting for exactly that question. He said, "What leaves with blessing does not leave like loss." He said, "When you release with the right intention, before fear talks you out of it, You make room in your soul before you ever make room in your account. I did not fully understand it then. I filed it somewhere without a name, but it stayed. The image of those old hands, the envelope, the quiet voice, the complete absence of hesitation. It stayed in me long after the evening was over. Years later, when I began managing real money, when the stakes were no longer theoretical, I finally understood why the order mattered. Before I tell you exactly what the order is, I need to say something about the advice you have already been given. I am not here to tell you that mainstream financial guidance is worthless. It is not worthless. Earning more, spending less, investing consistently, managing debt wisely, none of that is foolish. These things are real, they are useful, but they are incomplete in a way that matters more than most people realize. A spreadsheet cannot cure fear. An automated savings plan cannot fix a scarcity identity. Knowing every available investment vehicle will not stop you from sabotaging your own increase at the moment it arrives. Discipline applied from the wrong inner posture does not produce peace. It produces controlled anxiety, which is a different thing entirely. The financial advice most people receive trains them in earning, tracking, saving, and optimizing. What it almost never addresses is reverence, release, inner order. The invisible relationship between who you are becoming and what money is allowed to do in your life. You can automate your money and still live in spiritual famine. You can read every book on the market and still wake up feeling like something essential is missing. You can be technically correct in every financial decision and still feel, in the quiet moments, that the wealth you imagined has a ceiling you cannot explain and cannot seem to break through. Conventional advice trains you to control money. What I was taught is something different. What I was taught is how to be in right relationship with it. And when the relationship is wrong, when the inner posture is fear, when the operative emotion is scarcity, when every dollar is held like evidence against future danger, the same actions that would bless a rightly positioned life can quietly keep a misaligned one exactly where it is. So what was the rule? What was the order my grandfather honored that evening, that my father carried forward, that I have seen work across decades and circumstances? And why does intention decide whether the same outward act blesses one person and slowly corrodes another? A mind that does not flinch at release. A person who can hold abundance without being devoured by it because they have practiced, quietly and repeatedly, the discipline of letting go before they were sure it was safe. That is the number one investing rule I was given. Not a stock, not a sector, not a system. A posture, a sequence, a way of positioning yourself before you deploy any resource into the world. And even this is not enough, because the act alone can be corrupted. Let me give you the sequence precisely, because the order is not decorative. The order is the mechanism. When new income arrives, when a return comes in, when a profit is realized, when something unexpected lands in your account, you pause before you touch it. Not for days, just long enough to remember what this moment requires. You acknowledge the source, not with performance, not with a public declaration. In the private space between your mind and whatever you consider sacred, you recognize that this did not arrive by your effort alone. Timing played a role. Other people played a role. Something beneath the visible surface of cause and effect played a role. That recognition, quiet and sincere, is the beginning of the right posture. Then, first, before anything else, you set apart a portion. A real portion, not a token. Something that costs you enough to mean something. You direct it toward generosity, toward service, toward someone whose need is genuine, toward an obligation you consider sacred, toward a cause that has nothing to do with your own comfort or image. You release it without resentment, without bargaining, without the internal footnote that says, "I am doing this so that something good will return to me." You release it as an act of order, not as a transaction with heaven. Then, only then, you allocate the remaining money to your life, to your household, to your savings, to your investments. And when you invest from steadiness, not from adrenaline, not from the fear that you are missing something, not from the panic that someone else is moving faster than you, from the calm clarity of a person who has already completed the first obligation and is now free to think straight. You repeat this consistently, not perfectly, consistently, so that the sequence becomes the shape of your inner life around money, not just an occasional gesture. Timing. First, not last. Because generosity, after you have already indulged every other impulse, does not carry the same formative weight. It does not train the soul in the same direction. It becomes cleanup, not consecration. Consistency. Regular, not impulsive. Because a single dramatic act of release does not reshape the nervous system. Repetition does. The soul learns order the way the body learns balance, through practice that is regular enough to become instinct. Intention. Sincere, not theatrical. Because this is done in private. If the primary audience is other people, the act has already been redirected toward ego. And ego is one of the fastest ways to corrupt what could have been alignment. Inner stance, gratitude and trust. Not forced optimism, not denial of difficulty. A genuine settledness that says, I have honored the order and I trust that the order holds. This sequence, practiced faithfully, transforms the experience of money from a daily emergency into a disciplined channel, from a source of panic into a practice of peace. But there is a hidden contamination that ruins the whole pattern, and almost everyone falls into it at least once. The hand can open for entirely the wrong reason, and when it does, the outward act looks identical to the real thing, while the inner reality is almost its opposite. I learned this personally, not from a book. In an early season of success, when things were moving faster than I had expected, I began to notice something in myself, a kind of spiritual self-congratulation, the quiet pride of being someone who gives, the subtle pleasure of being known, even only to myself, as a generous person. And underneath that, something darker, a growing assumption that because I was honoring the sequence, increase was something I had earned the right to demand. That is not alignment. That is greed wearing the costume of spirituality. Let me name the corrupt versions clearly, because recognizing them is half the protection. Giving in order to get is not release, it is purchase. It is a transaction dressed in the language of generosity, and the soul knows the difference, even when the mind tries to argue otherwise. Public display, giving in a way that is designed to be seen, to build your identity as someone elevated, to earn the admiration of others, has already redirected the act away from its purpose. The return, if there is one, goes to the ego, and the ego is not the part of you that needed the lesson. Desperate bargaining, releasing money as a kind of payment you are making to force a specific outcome, keeps the heart tightly closed, even while the hand opens. You are still in control mode. You are still trying to purchase safety through a spiritual mechanism rather than actually trusting the order. Resentment after release, the quiet bitterness of having given and then watching to see whether the return arrives on the schedule you expected, corrodes the whole thing. Release with a timer attached is not release. Investing from panic is its own form of corruption. Chasing what someone else is making. Moving from comparison and wounded ego. Deploying money to prove something. Fear-driven deployment does not become wise deployment because it is preceded by a generous act. The posture in the moment of investing still matters. The same outward sequence can either align or distort, depending entirely on what is operating underneath it. Money is extraordinarily sensitive to the story you attach to it. Fear, vanity, control, shame. These do not stay hidden. They move through your decisions the way dye moves through water, coloring everything without announcing themselves. When the release becomes a transaction with heaven, the heart remains closed, even if the hand opens. And a closed heart at the center of an open hand is one of the most frustrating positions a person can occupy, because they are doing the right thing and wondering why it does not feel like anything is changing. So what actually happens when the order is clean? When the motive is honest and the sequence is honored without corruption? Why do some people begin to feel over time that life seems to move differently around them? Abundance is not simply more money. I want you to hold that for a moment before we continue. Abundance is a state. It is a condition in which provision, peace, timing, discernment, and inner capacity work together in the same direction at the same time. It is less chaos around money, not only more of it. And less chaos around money changes everything, because most financial mistakes are not made from lack of information. They are made from panic, from clouded judgment, from decisions taken at the worst possible inner moment. When the sequence I have described becomes your actual practice, something begins to shift that is not immediately visible on a balance sheet. The first change is usually clarity, a quieting of the noise. The hypervigilance around money, the constant scanning for threat, the flinching at every fluctuation begins to ease. Not because the numbers are suddenly perfect, but because the inner relationship with money has changed. You are no longer in a fearful, desperate negotiation with it every day. You are its steward. That is a different position entirely. From clarity comes patience, and from patience comes better decisions. The investments you skip because they feel wrong rather than just unfamiliar. The opportunities you recognize because you are not in the tunnel vision of scarcity. The risks you take cleanly because they come from discernment rather than desperation. Generosity, practiced consistently and sincerely, does something specific to the nervous system over time. It breaks the hypnosis of scarcity. Every time you release from the right place, you are demonstrating to the deepest part of yourself that you are not in danger, that there is enough to give and still have, that your survival does not depend on hoarding. And a nervous system that is no longer running a constant survival calculation becomes capable of something a frightened one never can. It becomes capable of receiving. People who grip cannot receive cleanly. There is always a contamination in the receiving, a suspicion, a guilt, a fear that what arrived will also leave. But the person who has trained themselves in ordered release has made interior room. And interior room is the true precondition for outer increase. What looks mystical from the outside often works through something entirely comprehensible from the inside: identity, perception, discipline, timing, and spiritual peace becoming one stream instead of competing currents. You stop asking only how to make more money. You begin asking what kind of person can hold it without being diminished by it. That question is the beginning of everything. You are no longer the person who was gripping from fear. Something in you has already shifted simply by following this far, because the ideas that land in the right soil do not need to wait for conscious permission. They begin working immediately. I want to name who you are becoming, because identity must carry the method. Occasional action without inner shift collapses under pressure. But when you know who you are, when the identity is clear, the behavior follows even when it is hard. You are becoming a channel, not a container, a vessel, not a vault. A steward who understands that the resources passing through your life are not yours to hoard, but yours to order, to bless, and to direct with wisdom and peace. You are no longer begging money to save you. You are no longer treating it as a judge of your worth or a master of your peace. You are becoming a household that handles money the way my grandfather handled that envelope at the table, with seriousness, with quiet, with the settled certainty of someone who knows the order and honors it without performance. Every dollar that passes through your hands from this point forward can be part of that identity. Not because you recite the right words, but because you are practicing the right sequence, in the right spirit, consistently enough that it becomes the shape of your inner life. The warning I will leave you with is this: the method alone, copied without the identity, will not hold. You can follow the steps perfectly and abandon them the first time a financial fear spikes hard enough. The steps have to be held by something deeper. They have to be held by the knowledge of who you are and who you are choosing to become. That knowledge is what the elders were always really trying to pass forward. I have heard from many people who began practicing this quietly. What they describe first is almost never a number. It is a feeling. The panic around money becomes less automatic. The decisions feel cleaner. The household tensions that money used to create begin to ease. There is a restoration of something they had not realized they lost, a sense of being in right relationship with the resources in their life rather than in daily combat with them. Some describe unexpected openings, not miraculous, not impossible to explain through ordinary cause and effect, but timed in a way that felt like confirmation. A conversation that happened at exactly the right moment. A decision made from clarity that a month earlier would have been made from panic, and the difference in outcome was significant. Others describe something quieter, and I think more important. They stopped feeling like money was an emergency. They began to relate to it as something they were responsible for, rather than something they were subject to. That shift, that single interior repositioning, changes the texture of an entire financial life. I want to be honest with you. What I have shared today is a beginning, not a complete transmission. What my grandfather carried, what my father passed to me, what I have spent decades testing and living inside, goes deeper than one conversation can hold. There is more to say about how this principle extends into investing choices specifically, about how it affects family culture around money across generations, about the language you use when you speak about money in your home, because words are not neutral, and neither is the atmosphere they create. There is a larger body of teaching around stewardship, timing, speech, and wealth consciousness that belongs together with what you have heard today. For those who want to go further, that door is open. The serious practitioner will find their way to the deeper material, because seriousness has a direction, and that direction leads forward. But for now, let what you have heard settle. Do not rush past it toward the next thing. Let me close by speaking over you directly. The issue was never only that you needed more information about money. The issue was order, reverence, release, identity. You were handed a map that left out the most important territory, and you navigated as well as anyone could with what you were given. That is not failure. That is the condition most people inherit. But you can inherit something different now. May your mind find peace around money, not as a distant hope, but as a present practice. May your household become a place where resources are handled with wisdom, with generosity, and with the settled certainty that order precedes increase. May your children watch you the way I watched my grandfather at that table, confused at first, then marked by something they will not be able to fully name, but will carry forward anyway. May your decisions come from clarity rather than fear. May your investments be made from steadiness rather than panic. May what leaves your hand with blessing return to your life with multiplication you did not have to force. You are becoming a peaceful steward. Say that to yourself quietly, as a fact and not a wish. If this has opened something in you, leave those words below. Let the next person who finds this teaching know that the order is being restored in another household. And stay close, because what has been shared today is the door. What comes next is the room behind it. May your house know peace around money.